The rain poured harder as his daughter tugged his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, pointing at the woman in heels slumped against her broken car, tears streaking her face. "Why is she crying?" Before we dive in, leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. The rain came down in sheets that night, thick and relentless, drumming on the hood of Ethan's old pickup like 1,000 restless hands. Wipers squeaked back and forth, struggling to keep up, and the heater rattled as if protesting the long day. Ethan Cole gripped the wheel, shoulders hunched, eyes tired from hours under fluorescent lights at the garage. His clothes still smelled faintly of oil and rubber, the perfume of a mechanic's life. Beside him in the passenger seat, his daughter Maya hummed off-key to a tune only she knew, her small hands holding a coloring book balanced precariously on her lap. She was 7 years old and carried with her the kind of resilience only children of single parents learn early. An acceptance of second-hand clothes, late-night ramen dinners, and laughter filling the gaps where money should have been. Ethan glanced at her and smiled despite the exhaustion. She caught him looking and grinned back, a gap-toothed smile that seemed brighter than the truck's dim headlights. For a moment the storm outside didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. But as the truck rounded a bend on the rural stretch leading out of town, those headlights swept across something that made Ethan's gut tighten. A sleek black sedan, foreign, expensive, the kind of car that had no business on these back roads, sat angled on the shoulder, hazard lights pulsing weakly through the rain. The driver's door was open and a figure in a tailored suit paced beside it, one hand pressed to a phone, the other, clenching and unclenching, like frustration had nowhere else to go. Even in the chaos of the storm, the posture was unmistakable, someone used to control, undone by a night that didn't care who they were. Ethan slowed instinctively. His body fought it. He was bone-weary, still damp from the shop shower, ready for nothing more than couch and sleep. Stopping meant more time in the rain, more delay, more trouble he couldn't afford. Yet he also knew too well what it felt like to be stranded, powerless on the side of the road, waiting for help that never came. From the passenger seat came a small voice, soft but steady. "Daddy," Maya said, tugging gently at his sleeve. She looked sad. The words were enough. Ethan sighed, turned on the blinker, and eased the truck to a stop behind the car. Rain hammered the windshield as he cut the engine. He could already feel the cold seeping in, the decision made for him, not by obligation, but by his daughter's unshakable kindness. He stepped out, boots splashing into a puddle, and approached. The woman turned quickly, eyes sharp, her blonde hair plastered to her forehead. Her suit was immaculate despite the rain, her heels sinking into the mud, her expression hovering somewhere between panic and pride. "I'm fine," she snapped before he could speak. "Roadside assistance is on the way." Her phone glowed uselessly in her hand, no bars flickering at the top. Ethan raised his hands in quiet surrender. "Didn't say you weren't," he replied, his voice low, steady. "Just figured I'd check." The woman's eyes flicked to his boots, his grease-stained jeans, then back to his face. Something unreadable passed across her features, suspicion tangled with a flicker of desperation she couldn't quite mask. "You're wasting your time," she said stiffly, though her voice trembled. Ethan tilted his head toward the car. "Pop the hood." For a heartbeat, she hesitated, as if the command challenged everything in her. Then, perhaps against her own instincts, she pressed the release. The hood creaked open, releasing a hiss of steam into the wet night. Ethan leaned over, flashlight in hand, rain streaking his hair into his eyes. The problem wasn't catastrophic. Belt gone, battery drained. Nothing he couldn't patch well enough to get her moving again. He worked silently, his breath fogging in the beam of light, tools clinking in rhythm with the rain. Maya appeared at his side, holding out a wrench with the solemn focus of a surgeon's assistant. Her hair was damp, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, but her smile never faltered. "Here, Daddy," she said. Ethan took it, nodding. "Thanks, kiddo." The woman watched, arms wrapped tight across her chest, mascara smudged from the rain. She had seen boardrooms buckle under her gaze, watched entire negotiations sway because of a single word from her lips. Yet here in the storm she was voiceless, a spectator to a father and daughter moving in quiet harmony. The way his rough hands guided the work, the way the little girl trusted without question, it was foreign to her, almost unbearable in its simplicity. Within minutes the engine coughed back to life, humming steady again. Ethan lowered the hood, rain dripping from his chin. He didn't offer a smile, didn't wait for praise, just wiped his hands on a rag pulled from his back pocket and stepped back. "That should get you where you're going," he said, voice calm, almost indifferent. The woman blinked, stunned. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. No one ever helped her without an invoice, a condition, a string attached. This quiet, unassuming act was something she hadn't encountered in years. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Maya, standing close to her father, peered up at the woman curiously. "Daddy?" she whispered, tugging at his sleeve again. "Why is she crying?" The question hung between them like lightning, sharp and unignorable. The woman turned away, brushing at her face as if the rain could disguise the truth. Ethan didn't push, didn't pry. He just gave her the space to collect herself, then added softly, "Safe travels, ma'am." And with that, he guided Maya back into the truck, the door creaking shut behind them. The woman stood in the rain, engine humming, watching their taillights disappear into the storm. For the first time in a long time, she felt something unshakable, the warmth of kindness from someone who expected nothing in return. And though she didn't know it yet, that night on the roadside would be the moment her life began to change. The engine sputtered one last reluctant cough before surrendering to silence. Rain hammered the roof like a drummer refusing to end the song, water sliding down the windshield in jagged streaks. Ethan bent under the hood, the beam of his flashlight catching the snapped belt, dangling like a broken tendon. The battery was nearly drained too, its last bit of life leaking out in the form of faint, uneven clicks. He had seen it 100 times before, a stranded car, a helpless driver. Only this time, the helpless driver wasn't a kid fresh out of college or a farmer from up the road. It was a woman who looked like she stepped out of the glossy cover of a business magazine, her sharp suit clinging to her in the rain, her perfectly coiffed hair undone into strands plastered against her cheeks. Claire Donovan was pacing, arms folded, trying to mask her anxiety with impatience. When Ethan straightened, wiping the water from his forehead with the back of his hand, she was already holding out a platinum credit card, her posture rigid with expectation. "Here," she said briskly. "Whatever it costs, just fix it." Ethan didn't even glance at the card. He gave a soft huff of breath, half amusement, half disbelief, and shook his head. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had worked too many late nights to waste words, "I don't charge stranded people on rainy roads. This one's on me." The words landed heavier than he intended. Claire froze, her arm still extended, the sleek card glinting under the faint beam of his flashlight. She blinked once, twice, as though her brain struggled to compute what he had just said. No transaction, no invoice, no strings. That wasn't how her world worked. Every interaction came with a price, a balance sheet, a hidden clause. This man was rewriting the rules, and she didn't know what to do with it. "You don't even know who I am," she said sharply, a note of defensiveness cutting through her disbelief. Ethan shrugged, leaning back under the hood to adjust the battery connection. "Doesn't matter." "You're stuck. I've been stuck before. Figure we all need someone to stop once in a while." Claire opened her mouth, closed it again. She hated how much that sentence hit her, like a finger pressed into a bruise she'd been ignoring. At that moment, Maya appeared at Ethan's side, shivering in the cold, her thin sweater no match for the storm. She studied Claire with the curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to filter her heart. Then, without hesitation, she tugged off her little jacket. pink, faded, with a missing button, and held it out with both hands. "Here," Maya said softly. "You look cold." The offer was so earnest, so impossibly pure, it nearly undid Claire completely. Her throat tightened, and she had to blink hard against the sting in her eyes. A child's jacket. A child's kindness. From a little girl who had nothing extra to give, but gave anyway. Claire didn't know how to respond. She couldn't accept it. Of course she couldn't. But the gesture itself was more disarming than any hostile takeover she had ever faced. "Why would you do this?" she whispered, not to Maya, but to Ethan, as though he were the only one capable of answering. Ethan tightened the last bolt and straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. He met her eyes with a calm steadiness that felt like solid ground. "Because someday," he said, "it'll be me out here, and I'd hope someone stops." The simplicity of it stripped her defenses bare. No rehearsed pitch, no polished statement, just a truth so ordinary it was extraordinary. Claire had built empires on the belief that everything had a price. And yet here, in the downpour, with grease-stained hands and a child's jacket, she was being offered something she hadn't felt in years: grace without condition. Moments later, the engine rumbled back to life, steady and strong. The hum filled the air, warm and alive, a sound that usually meant nothing to her, but now felt like salvation. Claire stared at the car, then at Ethan, words trapped in her throat. She had no language for this kind of generosity. Maya slipped her hand into Ethan's and tilted her head at Claire, her voice soft and innocent, yet carrying the weight of every unspoken truth in the rain. "Daddy?" she asked. "Why is she crying?" Claire's breath hitched. She turned quickly, swiping at her face, pretending it was just the storm clinging to her skin. She had stood in rooms where billions were decided, faced cameras that dissected her every flaw, but nothing had ever felt as exposing as a child asking why her heart was leaking through her eyes. Ethan didn't answer his daughter. He didn't need to. He simply touched her shoulder gently and said, "Safe travels, ma'am." His voice was quiet, firm, final. He wasn't asking for gratitude or recognition. He wasn't even asking for her name, just offering her back to the road with dignity intact. Claire slid behind the wheel, hands trembling slightly on the leather steering wheel. She looked once more at the mechanic and his daughter, silhouettes in the rain, father and child bound not by wealth or power, but by kindness. And something inside her shifted, subtle but seismic. No one had given her anything without asking for a return since she could remember. Yet tonight, in the middle of nowhere, a man who smelled of oil and rain and a girl with missing buttons on her jacket had imprinted themselves on her heart in a way she couldn't shake. As the car pulled back onto the road, the engine purring steady under her hands, Claire felt the tears return, unbidden, unstoppable. For the first time in years, she wasn't crying from stress or exhaustion or anger. She was crying because someone had seen her, not the CEO, not the headline, not the empire, but the stranded woman in the rain who needed help. And someone had stopped. The rain still hammered the highway, like it had no intention of letting up, a relentless percussion that drowned out everything except the steady hum of the engine Ethan had just coaxed back to life. Claire sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but not truly seeing it. She could feel him watching her from the corner of his gaze, not with judgment or expectation, but with a calm neutrality she wasn't used to. Before she could second-guess herself, before the wall she had carefully rebuilt over years of boardrooms and negotiations could slam shut again, she reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a card. The thick, embossed kind, the kind designed to make an impression. She held it out toward him through the open window, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her polished exterior. "If you ever need something," she said, her voice balancing between the clipped tone of command and something far softer, almost a plea, "call me." For a moment, Ethan only looked at her, the rain dripping steadily from his hair into his collar. Then, without flourish, without ceremony, he took the card and slipped it into the pocket of his damp work shirt as though it were nothing more than a receipt. "Safe travels, ma'am," he repeated, and turned back toward his truck. The dismissal should have irritated her. Men usually clung to that card like it was gold, their eyes widening at the recognition of her name, their posture shifting in an instant. But this man had taken it without even glancing at the letters pressed in black across the heavy cardstock. Claire Donovan, CEO. Donovan Tech, a name that could open doors, silence critics, buy time, buy anything. And yet to him it seemed like no more than paper. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure if she had been ignored or respected, and the confusion rattled her in ways a billion-dollar deal never had. Maya's small hand poked out the window of the pickup as Ethan climbed back inside. She waved, earnest and unpolished, her little jacket sleeves soaked through. "Bye," she called, her voice carrying even over the roar of the storm. Claire blinked, caught off guard by how much that tiny gesture cut through her. She raised her hand almost instinctively. A hesitant wave returned, and then it was over. The two vehicles pulled away in opposite directions, taillights vanishing into curtains of rain, two lives that should never have intersected now, linked by a moment that refused to let go. Later that night, Ethan dropped his keys onto the scarred wooden counter of his kitchen, the old trailer creaking under the weight of the storm outside. Maya had already curled up on the couch with a blanket, fast asleep, her sketchbook still clutched to her chest. He emptied his pockets mechanically, wallet, loose change, ragged receipts from the parts store, and there it was, stuck between his fingers like an afterthought. The card, heavy, pristine, absurdly out of place against the oil-stained surface of his life. He turned it over once, reading the name, Claire Donovan, CEO, Donovan Tech. The title meant little to him. He didn't have time to follow who ran what company in what city. His world was rent due on the first, transmissions that wouldn't shift, tires bald enough to invite trouble. He placed the card on the counter, shrugged, and forgot about it. Just another rich person's gesture. But in a high-rise penthouse that overlooked the glittering sprawl of the city, Claire Donovan could not forget. She lay awake in a bed that was too large and too empty, staring at the skyline that had once been a source of pride but now felt more like a taunt. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again. The mechanic's steady gaze, the girl's innocent voice asking, "Daddy, why is she crying?" The way her throat had tightened, not because of the rain, but because a child had seen through the mask she wore so carefully. She thought of her own childhood, years of watching her mother cry quietly at the kitchen table over bills no one else was willing to help with. She had sworn she would never be that vulnerable again. She had armored herself with success, built walls out of contracts and accolades until nothing and no one could touch her. But tonight, stranded in the rain, mascara streaked, shoes ruined, her armor had cracked, and standing in the gap had been a man with grease under his nails, and a little girl with wide, unfiltered eyes. Claire pressed her fingers against her temples, frustrated at herself for caring, for remembering, for replaying every detail of an encounter that should have been forgettable. Men helped her with things all the time, assistants, drivers, consultants. She paid them, they performed, and the world kept spinning. But this had been different. He had expected nothing. He had taken nothing. He had simply fixed the car, refused her money, and sent her on her way. It left her feeling both grateful and deeply unsettled. The card she had given him, her lifeline, her proof of identity, wasn't in her possession anymore. It sat somewhere in that mechanic's world, perhaps forgotten in a pile of old receipts, perhaps already smudged with grease. The thought made her chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. She had spent years making sure her name carried weight, and now the only man who didn't seem to care about it was the only one she couldn't stop thinking about. Rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows as she turned onto her side, restless. Her empire felt intact, untouched, but inside her, something had shifted. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside her chest. She wondered, not for the first time that night, if money really was the only currency that mattered, and for the first time in decades, she wasn't sure of the answer. The week had crawled by in the slow rhythm Ethan knew too well. Long hours under the hood, bills stacking like stubborn grease stains on the counter, the occasional neighbor stopping in with a sputtering engine and an apologetic smile. The garage smelled, as it always did, oil, rubber, and the faint sharpness of burnt coffee left too long on the pot. Life went on as it always had, steady and predictable. The kind of routine you didn't question, because questioning meant realizing how close to the edge you really lived. Maya sat cross-legged in the office window, sketchbook balanced on her knees, drawing cars that looked like spaceships and houses that floated in clouds. She hummed absent-mindedly, the sound blending with the rattle of Ethan's tools. He was elbow-deep in an old pickup's engine when he heard the low hum of an unfamiliar vehicle outside. Not the worn-out sedans or rusting trucks his customers drove, but something smoother, heavier. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped toward the open bay door. The sleek black SUV looked wildly out of place parked on the cracked asphalt outside his struggling shop. Its paint gleamed like polished obsidian even under the weak afternoon sun, its tinted windows reflecting back the skeleton of the garage like a distorted mirror. When the driver's door opened, Ethan half expected to see an assistant or some chauffeur dressed in a uniform. Instead, it was her. Claire Donovan stepped out alone. No entourage, no security, no clipboard-wielding staff trailing behind. Just her, in a tailored coat and heels that clicked softly against the oil-stained concrete. For a second, Ethan thought he was imagining her, maybe some fatigue-induced vision, but then he heard Maya's gasp behind him. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling between awe and disbelief. "It's her." Claire approached with careful steps, her expression unreadable. She looked out of place here, yet somehow not unwelcome. Ethan stood rooted, rag still in his hand, trying to understand why a woman like her would come back to a place like this. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice softer than he remembered, lacking the edge she had carried in the storm. "I wanted to thank you again for that night." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Maya, who was peeking around the office doorway with wide eyes. "You already did," Ethan replied. "Your car's running, isn't it?" Claire gave the faintest smile, though something flickered behind her eyes. Hesitation, maybe even nerves. For a woman who likely spoke to senators and investors daily, it was strange to see her searching for words. She held a small black envelope in her hands, running her thumb along the sealed edge like she wasn't entirely sure she should be offering it. "I wanted to ask you something," she said finally. "There's a charity gala next weekend. My company hosts it every year. I'd like you to come, both of you." Ethan blinked. Then, before he could stop himself, a laugh escaped, low and incredulous. "A gala? Lady, I don't even own a tie." Something softened in her expression, the practiced steel of her boardroom voice giving way to something closer to human. "Then you'll stand out," she said lightly, but there was an undertone to her words that suggested it mattered to her more than she let on. He shook his head, already retreating behind his usual defenses. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but that's not my world. People like me don't belong in places like that." "Maybe that's the point," she countered. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it carried a weight he couldn't ignore. She glanced toward Maya, who was clinging to the office doorframe, eyes wide with a hope that made Ethan's stomach tighten. "It's for a good cause. Music education, scholarships. You wouldn't just be guests, you'd be part of why it matters." He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her that showing up in a room full of billionaires and politicians would only end in humiliation. But then he saw Maya's face, lit with a kind of excitement she rarely let herself feel, Her whisper was almost reverent. "A real gala, Daddy, with lights and music and everything." Claire stepped forward, setting the envelope down on the counter beside his pile of unpaid invoices. Another slipped out of her coat pocket. 2 in total. 2 invitations, she said. "One for you, one for her. Consider it a thank you, please." Her eyes lingered on his, and for a brief moment Ethan saw it, the fragility hidden beneath her polished exterior. The armor she wore daily had cracks, and through them something vulnerable shone. It wasn't just an invitation to a gala, it was something else. A bridge, maybe, or a question. She turned before he could respond, heels clicking against the pavement, sliding back into the SUV with practiced grace. The engine purred to life, the kind of smooth sound Ethan's customers dreamed of, but could never afford. As she pulled away, Maya rushed forward, her little hands gripping the edge of the counter, staring at the black envelopes like they were treasure. "Daddy," she breathed, "we have to go." Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at the invitations, their weight out of place in a world of grease and grit. They looked almost dangerous, like ticking bombs that could blow up the fragile balance of his life if he let them. He told himself he didn't belong in that world, that it wasn't worth the trouble, but Claire's eyes lingered in his mind, the way her voice had shifted when she said, "Please." For the first time in a long time, Ethan wondered if this wasn't about cars at all. The suit itched. That was Ethan's first thought as he tugged at the collar, trying to loosen the noose his brother had optimistically called a tie. The jacket pulled too tight across his shoulders, and the sleeves ended awkwardly above his wrists, making him look like he'd grown 2 inches since putting it on. He had, in fact, lost a bet to his brother just to get it. "I'll never wear it again," his brother had said, handing it over with a smirk. Ethan suspected now that his brother had only ever worn it once himself, and then sworn vengeance on the world by passing it down. Beside him, though, none of that mattered. Maya twirled in her seat in the truck, smoothing the skirt of her best dress. It wasn't new, far from it. It had been bought for Easter Sunday 2 years ago, a little snug now at the waist, the hem creeping shorter than it once had. But she wore it like it was spun from gold, her braid bouncing against her shoulder as she giggled, too excited to notice her father's discomfort. The hotel loomed in front of them like a palace, windows glowing against the night sky, chandeliers already glittering through the glass. The kind of place Ethan usually drove past with his windows rolled tight, telling himself the people inside were from another planet altogether. Tonight, he was expected to walk through those doors. Inside, the lobby was a world he had no language for. Marble floors so polished they reflected back distorted versions of themselves, gold accents on everything from the banisters to the elevator doors, waiters in crisp uniforms carrying trays of champagne. And everywhere he looked, people dressed like they'd stepped out of magazines, gowns sweeping the floor, suits tailored to perfection. He felt every eye catch on him, on his ill-fitting suit, on Maya clutching his hand, on the calloused hands themselves, hands that had turned wrenches and hauled engines, now brushing against silk tablecloths like a stain that wouldn't come out. The whispers followed quickly, little murmurs disguised as polite conversation. "Who's that? He doesn't belong here. Why would she invite them?" Ethan stiffened, ready to make an excuse and get Maya out before she felt it too. But then he saw her, Claire. She moved through the crowd like light itself, radiant in a gown that shimmered with every step. But there was something else in her expression tonight, something Ethan hadn't expected. Nervousness. She scanned the room, searching, until her eyes found his. Relief softened her face instantly, and she walked toward them, each step deliberate, ignoring the gazes that trailed her. "Everyone," she said when she reached them, her voice clear, carrying across the nearest circle of donors and officials, "this is Ethan Cole and his daughter, Maya. They're the family who saved me on the road." The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through the room, a few polite smiles, a few raised brows, but more than that, a shift. Ethan flushed, the heat crawling up his neck, uncomfortable with the spotlight. He wanted to disappear, to tell her not to make a scene. But Claire's gaze didn't falter. She looked at him not with pity, not as if she'd dragged him into her world as some novelty, but with pride. Maya clung to his hand, eyes wide, as she took in the chandeliers, the music swelling softly from the orchestra, the endless tables draped in ivory linens. Her little fingers tightened, and Ethan felt her nerves against his palm. But then Claire leaned down, her voice soft enough for only Maya to hear. "You look beautiful," she said. Maya's smile returned instantly, shy but glowing. Claire guided them through the room, ignoring the stares, ensuring they didn't fade into the background. She made sure they sat at her table, right near the front where the donors and officials gathered, as if to make a point. When anyone raised a question with a glance or a half-whispered comment, she silenced it with a look that could cut glass. She was used to commanding rooms, but tonight she wielded that power not for herself, but for them. Ethan sat stiffly at the table, watching polished men sip champagne, watching the women around him glitter in diamonds. He reached for his water glass, certain he'd knock it over, and almost did. Maya laughed quietly beside him, her hand brushing his arm. And for the first time, he felt something shift. Claire wasn't embarrassed by him. She wasn't apologizing for inviting him here. She was making it clear to everyone who mattered in this room that she was proud to have him by her side. For Claire, it was more than gratitude. It was defiance, a rebellion against a world that measured worth in wealth and status. She had spent her life proving herself in those terms, but tonight, standing beside a man who had nothing to offer but honesty, and a little girl who gave her jacket away in the rain, she found herself unshackled from those rules. And for Maya, it was pure magic. She wasn't counting the stares or hearing the whispers. She was only seeing her father, seated at a table draped in silk, treated like someone who mattered. Her eyes sparkled as she leaned against him, whispering, "Daddy, we're in a castle." Ethan looked around, at the chandeliers that shimmered like stars, at the sea of strangers dressed in perfection, at Claire standing tall beside them. He still felt out of place, still felt the tug of humility pulling him back toward the shadows. But when he looked at his daughter's face, at her unfiltered joy, and then at Claire's steady gaze, proud, unwavering, something inside him shifted. Maybe, just maybe, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just a man fixing broken things. Maybe he was someone worth being seen. The ballroom glittered like something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors. Champagne towers gleamed like glass cathedrals, and the orchestra in the corner played soft and precise, as if their music was meant to blend into the wallpaper rather than be heard. Everywhere Ethan looked, people shimmered, sequins, diamonds, silk that whispered when they moved. Laughter rose and fell like waves on a shoreline, practiced and polished, the kind of laughter that had never known hunger or bills stacked on the kitchen counter. Ethan tugged at the too-tight collar of his borrowed suit. The air was thick, heavy with perfume and money, and he could feel it pressing against him like a hand on his chest. Every surface gleamed, every gesture rehearsed, and the farther into the room he went, the smaller he felt. He didn't have to try hard to hear the whispers. They clung to him like static. Who let the grease monkey in? She must be doing some kind of charity outreach. Look at his hands, calluses on white linen. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Years of swallowing pride had trained him well. He glanced down at Maya, who was holding his hand so tightly her little knuckles were white. Her braid brushed her shoulder as she leaned in close, her voice small and trembling. "Daddy, can we go?" "Please." The words cut deeper than the whispers. He wanted nothing more than to scoop her up and take her far away from this place, back to their world of wrenches and worn-out sofas, where she didn't have to hear strangers laughing at them. His chest ached with the urge to protect her. He opened his mouth to say yes. But before he could, the lights shifted. Claire was stepping onto the stage. She moved with the kind of presence that silenced a room without raising her voice, the kind of command that came from years of conquering boardrooms. Yet tonight, there was something different in her poise. She wasn't the untouchable CEO Ethan had seen in headlines. She was a woman standing in front of a room full of people who thought they already knew her, and she was about to tell them something they didn't. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth but steady, carrying past the orchestra and the clinking of glasses. "Tonight, we gather for more than glamour. We gather to remember what resilience looks like, what community truly means. We're here because the world is built on the shoulders of people most of us never see." Murmurs quieted. Heads tilted, curiosity sparked. Claire's eyes swept across the crowd, her gaze sharp but unyielding. We celebrate brilliance, but brilliance isn't always on a stage or in a spotlight. Sometimes it's in classrooms where teachers give more than they earn. Sometimes it's in hospitals where nurses work past exhaustion. And sometimes, she paused, and her eyes locked on Ethan, it's in the hands of the people who stop to help you when no one else does. Ethan felt the blood rush to his face. The words hit him like a spotlight he hadn't asked for, exposing him to hundreds of eyes at once. Applause thundered through the room, chairs scraping as people stood, some out of genuine admiration, some because that's what one did when a speech demanded it. Ethan sat rigid, his daughter clinging tighter, unsure if he should feel pride or humiliation. He wasn't used to being seen. The applause had barely died before another voice sliced through it, smooth, mocking, sharpened to wound. "Well," drawled Langdon Pierce, a rival executive whose silver cufflinks gleamed almost as much as his smirk. "How inspiring. Though I'm not sure polishing wrenches qualifies as saving the world." Laughter rippled through a few corners of the room, polite, nervous, but enough to sting. Ethan's stomach churned. He pushed his chair back, ready to stand, ready to get Maya out before the weight of ridicule crushed her spirit. But then Claire's voice rang out, sharp as glass. "Langdon," she said, not a hint of warmth in her tone, "that man fixes broken engines. Engines that take people to work, to school, to hospital beds. Engines that keep families moving, that hold lives together when they have no margin to break. Tell me, when was the last time you fixed anything that mattered?" The words detonated in the air. Gasps rippled across the room, and Langdon's smirk faltered, his eyes blinking rapidly as if unaccustomed to being challenged so publicly. Silence followed, thick and stunned, before applause surged again, louder this time, unrestrained. Not everyone clapped, but those who did made sure their hands were heard. Ethan sat frozen, his breath caught in his throat. Claire wasn't just thanking him, she wasn't repaying a favor. She was standing between him and a world that had already decided he wasn't worth notice. She was telling him, that he mattered. Maya looked up at her father, her little face glowing with something more than awe, pride. The kind of pride that made Ethan's chest ache in an entirely new way. She whispered, barely audible over the applause, "She's on our side." And for the first time that night, Ethan let himself believe it. Claire Donovan, untouchable CEO, hadn't just brought him here as a guest. She had chosen to stand with him, against all of them, and there was no hiding from that truth anymore. The night air on the balcony was cooler than inside, carrying the faint tang of rain on metal and the distant hum of traffic far below. After hours of champagne glasses clinking, polished laughter, and conversations sharp enough to draw blood, the quiet felt almost foreign. Claire leaned against the railing, her gown catching in the faint breeze, her eyes fixed on the city stretched out like a sea of stars. Skyscrapers glittered, bridges glowed, and the pulse of the metropolis seemed endless, relentless. Yet for once she didn't feel on top of it. She felt suspended, hovering somewhere between the woman she had become and the girl she once was. Behind her, Ethan stepped out slowly, his presence unannounced but grounding. He didn't look like he belonged here, his suit was still too small, His tie knotted crookedly, but there was something steady about him, like he belonged anywhere he chose to stand. His boots scuffed softly against the stone as he came to lean beside her, gripping the railing with hands scarred from years of labor, hands that knew the language of engines better than words, hands that had steadied her in a storm without even meaning to. Claire exhaled, a long sigh that seemed to pull years out of her. "I wasn't always this," she said finally, her voice low, almost unsure. "People see me now and think I was born with a silver spoon, or that I just stepped into it. But I wasn't. I grew up in a house where the electricity went out more often than it stayed on, where dinner was sometimes just bread and whatever canned food my mom could stretch. My father left when I was 9. I decided I was never going to be powerless like that again." Ethan listened quietly, eyes fixed on the skyline, his jaw working, but his voice silent. She went on, the words spilling faster now, as if she had been holding them in for years. "I clawed my way here. Every deal, every meeting, every headline, each one was another brick in a wall I built around myself. I thought it was strength. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I saw opportunities, risks, assets, losses. I told myself it was survival, but really, I think I forgot what humanity looked like." Her laugh was soft and brittle, breaking apart in the night air. "And then you show up on the side of a road, fixing my car in the rain, refusing my money, letting your daughter hand me her jacket. It was like someone held up a mirror, and I didn't recognize the face staring back at me anymore." Ethan's grip tightened on the railing, his knuckles pale against the steel. For a long moment he didn't speak. He just let the silence stretch, not uncomfortable but steady, like an engine idling. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, but certain. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," he said. "Everyone breaks down sometimes, even cars." Claire let out a shaky breath that turned into a laugh, softer this time, more real. It wasn't the laugh of a CEO charming a boardroom. It was the laugh of a woman who hadn't let herself be vulnerable in years. But the laugh caught in her throat, and her eyes shone with tears she tried and failed to blink away. Ethan didn't reach for her. He didn't rush to fix it. He simply stood beside her, steady and unyielding, his presence like a shelter she hadn't known she needed. He had spent his life repairing broken things, but tonight he understood instinctively that she didn't need repair. She just needed someone who wouldn't walk away when the cracks showed. The city below glittered on, but up here on the balcony it was just the two of them, her gown brushing against his worn sleeves, her painted nails gripping the rail beside his calloused fingers. For a woman who had been dissected by journalists, analyzed by investors, commodified by a world that measured her in dollars and headlines, the silence beside Ethan felt more healing than any ovation she had ever received. She turned her head slightly, studying his profile, the way the city lights caught in his dark eyes, the way his presence seemed to anchor the very air around him. "You don't even realize, do you?" she whispered. He glanced at her, brows furrowed. "Realize what?" "How rare this is," she said. "Someone who doesn't want anything from me. Not my money, not my name. Just this." She gestured faintly to the quiet, the space between them. "Do you know how long it's been since I had that?" Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a beat longer before returning to the city. "Maybe it's not as rare as you think," he said. "Maybe you just stopped looking in the places where it still exists." Her throat tightened again, but she smiled through it, small and unsteady. The city stretched out below, dazzling and relentless, but up here it felt like the world had finally slowed down. For the first time in years, Claire Donovan wasn't a CEO, wasn't a headline, wasn't a commodity. She was just a woman standing on a balcony with a mechanic who didn't see her as anything other than human. And for her, that was everything. The following week, the black sedan rolled into Ethan's cracked lot like a shadow that didn't belong. It was too polished, too sleek for the kind of place where rusted trucks came in coughing their last breaths, and farmhands leaned against the counter with grease already under their nails. Ethan spotted it through the garage door while he tightened a bolt under the hood of an ancient pickup. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, already knowing before the door even opened who it was. Claire Donovan stepped out, her heels clicking against gravel, her coat crisp and tailored, the faint scent of expensive perfume clinging to the damp autumn air. But her stride wasn't quite as confident as the night of the gala. It carried hesitation, the smallest crack in the armor she wore like second skin. Ethan didn't bother asking what was wrong with the car. He could tell by the way she didn't glance back at it, the way her keys dangled loosely from her fingers, that nothing was wrong at all. She had come for something else. Still, he didn't press. Some truths didn't need dragging into the open. From the office window, Maya spotted her and lit up like she'd seen a celebrity, which, in a way, she had. She bounded out the door, her braid bouncing behind her, clutching a juice box in her small hand. "Hi, Miss Claire," she chirped, shoving the box into Claire's palm without ceremony. "Apple today. It's the good kind." Claire laughed, startled by the earnestness, and accepted it as if it were a glass of champagne at a board meeting. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. Something about Maya's unfiltered affection disarmed her every time. She didn't have to earn it, didn't have to calculate it. It was just there, given freely. She drifted into the shop, her heels tapping against the concrete, her eyes roaming over shelves stacked with tools, jars of bolts labeled in Ethan's uneven handwriting, calendars stained with fingerprints, and the faint radio hum in the corner playing classic rock. She watched Ethan bend over the engine, sleeves rolled, muscles in his forearms flexing with each precise movement. There was a rhythm to the way he worked, as if even the clank of tools had its own cadence. Maya climbed onto a stool beside him, holding a small flashlight steady. "Like this, Daddy?" she asked, wobbling as the beam danced across the metal. "Steadier," Ethan murmured, glancing over with patience that seemed endless. "Engines like honesty. They don't like being lied to." Maya giggled, adjusting her grip. "I'm not lying. I'm just wobbly." He smiled faintly, a rare softness tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then be less wobbly." Claire stood back, the juice box cool in her hand, watching the two of them with something that ached deep in her chest. It wasn't envy, exactly. It was longing. A memory she hadn't allowed herself to touch in decades, stirring like dust in the corners of her mind. "My father was a mechanic," she said suddenly, the words leaving her mouth before she had time to smooth them. Ethan paused, leaning on the hood, rag in hand, but didn't turn to her. She stared down at the concrete floor, her voice quieter now. "He died when I was 17. I never stepped into a shop again, until now." The weight of the confession settled between them. Maya, not fully grasping the gravity of it, kept her flashlight trained on the engine, humming to herself. Ethan finally looked up, his gaze steady, unreadable. He didn't soften his features out of pity, didn't try to fill the silence with apologies that never healed. He just nodded once. "Guess you came full circle," he said simply. The words landed differently than any sympathy could have. They didn't press against the wound. They acknowledged it without trying to change it. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tightening as she looked around the garage. The smell of oil, the clutter of tools, the steady sound of an engine breathing under someone's care. It all pulled her back to evenings in her father's shop, watching him wipe his hands on the same kind of rag, listening to the same kind of hum from the radio. She had buried those memories under skyscrapers and glass offices, under boardrooms where the only hum was of ambition and greed. And yet here, in this small, unremarkable garage, they rose again like ghosts she didn't know she'd been missing. She lifted the juice box and took a sip, a smile tugging faintly at her lips. It was absurd drinking apple juice in heels that had walked the marble floors of world headquarters. Absurd, and yet comforting. Ethan bent back over the engine, not asking more, not intruding. Maya swung her legs happily, flashlight beam steady at last. And Claire, standing in the middle of grease and laughter and patience, felt more at home than she had in decades. The diner buzzed with the familiar hum of neon lights and the low murmur of conversations from truckers and families huddled in vinyl booths. The scent of fried food clung to the air, a mix of grease and comfort that seemed to coat the walls as much as it did the food. Ethan slid into a booth across from Maya, who had already grabbed a crayon and started scribbling on the back of a paper placemat. The waitress, a woman who looked like she'd been here since the place was built, set down 3 glasses of water without asking, her pen already tapping against her notepad. Claire arrived a few minutes later, drawing more stares than she ever realized. Her tailored coat and heels looked impossibly out of place among the denim jackets and trucker caps, but she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she noticed too much and forced herself not to care. She slid into the booth beside Maya, smoothing her coat as if it were a shield, and offered a small, genuine smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." Maya's eyes lit up. "You're not." "You're never intruding." The little girl scooted closer and nudged the basket of fries toward her. "You have to try these. They're the best in town." Claire laughed softly and took one, the salt and grease instantly grounding her in a way fine dining never could. She looked at Ethan across the table, his sleeves rolled up, his expression guarded but not unfriendly. He had the same look he always wore when she entered his world, like he wasn't sure if she would break it or make it better. They ordered simply, burgers, fries, milkshakes. Conversation flowed in uneven patches, moments of small talk woven between stretches of silence that didn't feel uncomfortable, only unpracticed. Maya filled most of the gaps with chatter about school projects and the latest cartoon she liked, her voice a steady rhythm against the clink of cutlery. It happened between bites of fries, casual and uncalculated, the way children often toss truths into the air without knowing how sharp they are. Maya looked up at Claire, her lips still shiny with ketchup, and asked, "Miss Claire, do you ever get lonely?" The question sliced through the air, sharper than any critic's remark, sharper than any boardroom insult Claire had ever faced. She froze, her practiced smile faltering for the first time all evening. For a heartbeat, the clatter of plates from the kitchen seemed louder. The scrape of a chair on linoleum harsher, every sound magnified by the silence at their booth. "Sometimes," Claire admitted softly, the word tasting foreign in her mouth. "Yes, sometimes I do." Maya nodded slowly, like she understood far more than her age should have allowed. She dipped another fry into ketchup, as if satisfied with the answer, and returned to her meal. But Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening, his protective instinct kicking in. He didn't like his daughter carrying the weight of questions like that, not when the answers pressed into places too heavy for a child to hold. He opened his mouth to change the subject, but Claire leaned forward before he could. Her gaze was steady, her voice gentler than he had ever heard it. "That's why I'm glad I met you two," she said, almost in a whisper, as if the words weren't meant for the whole world, just for them. Ethan stilled, his protest dying on his tongue. It wasn't the polished confession of a woman who had built empires, nor the rehearsed charm of someone used to convincing others. It was raw, stripped bare of the armor she usually carried. He saw it then, the cracks behind her posture, the tiredness in her eyes that no amount of diamonds or skyline views could disguise. She wasn't untouchable. She was just as breakable as anyone else, maybe more so. Maya smiled softly, slipping her hand into Claire's without hesitation. The sight of it made Ethan's chest ache in ways he couldn't explain. His daughter, who gave her jacket to strangers and asked questions most adults avoided, had a way of seeing people for what they were, not what they pretended to be. And she saw Claire. The rest of the meal passed in quieter tones, the kind where words weren't needed to prove anything. Claire laughed once, real laughter, unpolished and unexpected, when Maya spilled her milkshake and Ethan fumbled to clean it with too many napkins. The sound startled her, as if she hadn't heard it from herself in years. When the night ended, they stepped into the cool air outside, the neon sign buzzing above them, casting pink and blue halos across the pavement. Claire hugged Maya goodbye, holding her a fraction longer than was necessary, then slipped into her black sedan. Ethan watched the car's taillights disappear down the road, glowing like embers in the dark. Maya tugged at his sleeve, her voice quiet now, thoughtful. "She cries when she's alone, doesn't she?" Ethan looked down at his daughter, at her wide eyes filled with too much wisdom for her age. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, kiddo," he said, his voice rough. "Some people have all the lights in the world, but no warmth." Maya leaned against him, silent, and for a long moment, standing there under the hum of neon and the smell of fried food still lingering in their clothes, Ethan wondered if maybe their little world had just grown big enough to hold someone else's loneliness too. The first headline hit like a slap. Claire was halfway through a meeting when her assistant slid the tablet toward her, lips tight, eyes flicking nervously away. On the glossy screen was a photograph that should have been harmless. Claire Donovan in a small-town garage, her silk blouse streaked with grease, laughing at something Maya had said while Ethan leaned over an engine nearby. The caption, however, was anything but benign. CEO of Donovan Tech trades boardrooms for blue-collar company? Who's the mystery mechanic? By afternoon, more followed. Paparazzi shots, blurry but damning in their implication, of Claire stepping out of her car in front of Ethan's garage. A grainy image of Maya handing her a juice box, her braid swinging like a halo of innocence, contrasted against Claire's tailored world. And the narrative spun itself, as it always did, that she was distracted, unprofessional, reckless. Investors called within hours, questions sharpened like knives. "Your judgment is being questioned. This mechanic, what is he to you? Do you understand the message this sends to shareholders?" Words piled on top of each other, sterile yet cutting, all boiling down to the same thing. You are jeopardizing the empire. The board meeting was worse. Men in suits leaned forward across polished oak, voices low but full of bite. "Your credibility is at risk, Claire. You've spent years cultivating an image of precision, control. And now?" One slid a copy of a tabloid across the table, the ink still smelling fresh. On the cover she was laughing, grease on her sleeve, Maya's small hand tucked into hers. It should have been humanizing. Instead, it was ammunition. "We can't afford this distraction," another warned. "If you want to be seen as a leader, act like one. Distance yourself." Claire sat straighter, her face a mask of calm she'd perfected long ago, but inside something twisted. They weren't wrong. In her world, perception mattered more than truth. She had built her kingdom on the scaffolding of appearances, and appearances right now were dangerous. Langdon Pierce smelled blood. At a charity luncheon, he quipped loudly enough for microphones to catch, "Seems Claire's new business model is less mergers and more mechanics." Maybe she's auditioning for a reality show. The laughter that followed burned her ears. She smiled through it, but her hands clenched under the table, nails digging crescents into her palm. When she finally pulled into Ethan's lot that evening, the weight of it all pressed so heavily on her that she could barely step out of the car. He was waiting near the garage door, wiping his hands on a rag, the news already reaching him. He'd seen the headlines, the pictures, the vultures circling. "They can't even let you breathe," he said, voice low, steady, furious in a way that didn't flare outward, but burned hot beneath the words. She exhaled, leaning against the car as if it might hold her up. "In my world, you're either untouchable or devoured," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "There's no in-between." Ethan studied her, his jaw tight, his eyes unflinching. He didn't pity her. He didn't soften his tone to console. "Maybe it's time to stop living in their world," he said simply. The words landed like a foreign language, one she had once known but forgotten. She looked at him, her lips parting, but no answer came, because what he was offering wasn't strategy. It wasn't survival. It was freedom, and freedom terrified her more than scrutiny ever had. She turned away, arms wrapping tightly across her chest as the twilight deepened around them. Could she really choose authenticity over power? Could she trade skyscrapers for silence, headlines for honesty? And if she did, what would it cost her? Inside the garage, Maya's laughter floated through the air as she drew on scrap paper, oblivious to the storm raging outside adult lives. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, letting that sound seep into her bones. It was warmth, uncalculated, unearned, something she hadn't realized she needed until now. But fear clawed at her still, sharp and insistent. Empires did not forgive their builders for stepping off the throne. And yet, as she stood there with Ethan's steady gaze holding hers, she wondered if maybe, for once, the cost of holding on was greater than the cost of letting go. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. It began with small things, a text delayed, a phone call cut short. Plans shifted at the last minute. At first, Ethan chalked it up to her schedule. Claire Donovan was a CEO. She lived in a whirlwind of boardrooms and deadlines. But then the cancellations multiplied. Days stretched into weeks without her car rolling into the lot, without her laughter softening the edges of the shop. It was Maya who noticed first. One afternoon, while coloring in the office, she looked up at her father with the kind of honesty children wield like a blade. "Daddy?" she asked quietly. "Did she forget us?" Ethan froze, the question landing heavier than any wrench in his hand. He crouched down beside her, smoothing a loose strand of hair from her face. His smile was faint, but his voice was steady. "No, kiddo. Sometimes grown-ups get scared, that's all." Maya studied him for a moment, as if testing the truth in his words. Then she nodded, though the shadow of doubt lingered in her eyes. For Ethan, the ache was harder to hide. He tried to bury it in work, in late nights at the garage, in fixing what was broken with tools that always did what they were told. But some silences couldn't be patched, and hers was one of them. It wasn't until one evening, long after he'd closed the garage and sent Maya home with a neighbor, that he saw the black sedan parked in the shadows just beyond the lot. At first, he thought it was empty. Then, as he approached, he saw her, Claire, sitting behind the wheel, her hands gripping it so tightly her knuckles were white. He tapped gently on the glass. She startled, then lowered the window, the cool night air rushing in. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red, the kind of exhaustion makeup couldn't disguise. "You planning on sitting out here all night?" Ethan asked softly, leaning against the car. Claire exhaled, her breath shaky. "I couldn't make myself walk in." "Why?" Her eyes darted away, fixed on the dim light above the garage door. "Because I'm terrified," she admitted, the words sounding foreign, like a language she hadn't spoken in years. "I'm terrified of ruining your life. They'll call you names, drag you down with me. You don't deserve that." Ethan crossed his arms, his presence steady, grounding. "Claire," he said, his tone quiet but firm, "you don't scare me. But walking away, that does." Her eyes snapped back to his, wide and wet. For a moment she looked nothing like the woman who commanded empires. She looked small, raw, a child again staring at doors she didn't know how to open. Tears spilled before she could stop them, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. She pressed a hand to her face, shaking her head. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I've always known. Always had the answer. But now, I don't. Not with you, not with her." Ethan reached through the open window, not to pull her out, not to fix what she was breaking under, but to place his hand gently over hers on the steering wheel. His hand was rough, scarred but steady. "Then don't do it alone," he said. She swallowed hard, her throat working around the weight of words unsaid. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything she couldn't admit and everything he already understood. For the first time in her life, Claire Donovan, CEO, strategist, untouchable, allowed herself to say nothing, to simply sit in the uncertainty with someone who wouldn't leave. Ethan realized in that moment that some breaks weren't meant to be fixed. Some breaks weren't mechanical. They were human, and the only way to carry them was together. So he stayed there beside her car in the quiet night, his hand resting over hers, until her breathing slowed, until the trembling faded. No speeches, no promises, no solutions. Just presence. For a man who had spent his life repairing engines, holding pieces together with bolts and steel, it was the hardest, most necessary lesson of all. Not everything could be fixed. But maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The silence between them had grown thick in the days that followed. Claire still came around, but less often. Her visits clipped at the edges as though she were rationing herself. She would stand near the counter, answering texts even while pretending she was off the clock, her smile polite but frayed. Ethan noticed the distance, the way her eyes carried weight, but he didn't press. Maya, though, noticed everything. Children always did. One Saturday afternoon, while Ethan was bent under the hood of a Chevy with a bad alternator, Maya sat in the office with a box of crayons and a sheet of paper pulled from the printer. She drew furiously, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth, her little brow furrowed in concentration. When Claire walked in, the bell over the door chiming softly, Maya didn't run to greet her like usual. She stayed put, scribbling in bright, uneven strokes, until finally she hopped down from the chair and marched across the room. "Here," she said, thrusting the paper toward Claire's hands. Claire blinked, caught off guard. She wasn't used to being handed things without warning. Proposals, contracts, reports, yes, but not this. She unfolded the sheet carefully, and what she saw nearly stopped her breath. 3 stick figures, drawn in crooked lines and wild colors. One tall, with dark hair, one small with braids, one blonde with a triangle of a dress. They were holding hands. Above them, in rainbow letters that tilted unevenly, was a single word: family. For a long moment Claire just stared. The word looked foreign, as if it belonged to a world she had been locked out of for decades. Her throat tightened, and she had to press her lips together to steady them. She looked up, blinking hard, only to find Ethan stepping in quickly, wiping his hands on a rag, alarm flashing in his eyes. "Maya," he said, his voice firm but uneasy, "you don't just—" He cut himself off, glancing at Claire with apology written all over his face. "I'm sorry. She's just a kid. Sometimes she—" But Claire shook her head, her grip on the paper tightening. "No," she whispered, her voice raw and unpolished. "Don't apologize." "She sees clearer than we do." Ethan froze, rag clutched in his hands. He wasn't used to her voice like this, stripped of polish, trembling at the edges. Claire looked back down at the drawing, tracing the lines of the crooked little figures with her eyes. It shouldn't have meant so much. It was just crayons on paper, the kind of thing a child made every day. But to her it felt like something sacred. Maya shifted, suddenly shy, her voice small. "It's us. 'Cause I think we belong together." The words hit harder than Claire was ready for. Her chest ached with something she had buried too long. The memory of dinners eaten alone in a cavernous penthouse, the way silence echoed louder than applause when she came home from victories that should have felt triumphant. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat, crouching so she could look Maya in the eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking on the second word. "I'll keep it forever." Ethan turned away, busying himself at the workbench. Though his hands moved slower than usual, he didn't know how to stand in this moment, how to balance pride in his daughter's honesty with fear of what it might cost. Later that evening, Claire returned to her office high above the city. The glass walls reflected a skyline lit with ambition, towers glowing like constellations, each one a monument to power. She sat at her desk, surrounded by contracts worth billions, reports bound in leather, forecasts that charted the future of her empire, and yet her eyes went to the folded sheet of paper she had carried with her all day, tucked safely into her bag like treasure. She smoothed it gently and pinned it to the board above her desk, right in the center, where no report or stock analysis could eclipse it. The crooked figures, the rainbow letters spelling family, looked almost defiant against the sterile neatness of her office. But it was the first thing she wanted to see each morning and the last thing before she left at night. Every time her board questioned her decisions, every time investors muttered about perception and power, her eyes drifted to that drawing, and it reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten, that the family you choose, the ones who see you without the armor, are the ones who save you in the end. For Claire Donovan, billionaire CEO, conqueror of boardrooms, that simple crayon sketch was worth more than every signature inked in her empire. It was the proof that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been lost forever. The shareholder meeting had the tense hum of a courtroom. Cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like tiny predators waiting to catch blood. Suits filled every row, murmuring behind glossy folders, the air heavy with money and expectation. Claire sat at the long mahogany table, the skyline stretching behind her through floor-to-ceiling glass. But tonight the city's glow felt more like interrogation lights than a view. She adjusted the clasp on her cuff and waited for the storm she knew was coming. Langdon Pierce didn't make her wait long. He leaned back in his chair like a man who already owned the verdict, a lazy smirk curling his lips. "So," he began, his voice carrying the practiced drawl of someone who loved an audience. "While our competitors are courting international investors, our CEO is spending her evenings at a garage with her new mechanic boyfriend." The word dropped like acid into the room. A ripple of chuckles spread nervous and cruel as cameras flashed, catching every raised eyebrow and every tightened jaw. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some hiding behind papers, others staring openly, waiting to see how she would spin it. Claire felt the familiar urge to retreat into Polish, to summon the carefully crafted lines her PR team would have written, something sterile and forgettable. But when she glanced down the table, the crayon drawing in her leather folder flashed through her mind. 3 figures holding hands under the word family. And something in her snapped. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate, until the room stilled. Her eyes swept across the rows, steady, unflinching. "Yes," she said, her voice clear enough to cut through the murmurs. "He's a mechanic." The room stirred, surprised by the bluntness. Langdon's smirk widened, ready to pounce, but Claire didn't give him the chance. "He fixes what's broken," she continued, her voice rising, not with anger, but conviction. "When's the last time any of you did the same?" The silence that followed was different now, thicker, sharper. She saw some scoff, exchanging smirks as if she'd lost her mind, but others leaned forward, their expressions shifting, not with mockery but with something closer to curiosity. She had their attention, and for the first time in years, she didn't want to waste it on scripted safety. "I forgot what leadership was," she said, each word hitting like a hammer on stone, "until a man who earns in a year what I spend in a day reminded me. Leadership is not about image. It's not about perception. It's about service. About seeing the people who keep this world moving, the ones who don't get cameras in their faces or their names in headlines." A murmur swelled, not laughter this time, but the restless shifting of people confronted with truth. Some nodded slightly, some frowned, but all of them listened. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears, but she didn't falter. "I've sat in this room for years, feeding you numbers and strategies, bowing to your fears of market optics. And in doing so, I forgot the very reason I fought my way here. I forgot that power without humanity isn't leadership, it's just noise." Her gaze cut back to Langdon, holding him still under the weight of her words. "So mock me if you want. Call him a mechanic like it's an insult. But the truth is, He has done more to teach me what it means to lead than this room full of polished suits ever has." The final words echoed, raw and unfiltered, hanging in the air like the strike of a bell. She hadn't planned them. They weren't safe or calculated, but they were hers. For a long moment the room didn't move. Then a single clap rang out from the back row. Another followed. Then more. It wasn't unanimous. Some sat frozen, lips tight with disapproval, but the applause grew, hesitant at first, then swelling, spreading through the hall like a tide she couldn't stop, even if she wanted to. Claire stood tall, her chest rising with each unsteady breath. For the first time in her career, she hadn't hidden behind polished statements. She had spoken the truth, and it felt like shedding armor she'd carried too long. When the applause finally ebbed, she gathered her papers, though she couldn't remember what was written on them anymore. She walked out of the boardroom without glancing back, cameras still flashing, questions flying in her wake. She didn't know if she had just saved her career or set it on fire. But as she stepped into the quiet of the hallway, her pulse still thrumming with adrenaline, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had finally told the truth. And no matter the cost, she would not take it back. The hum of the garage at night was different from the daytime rhythm. Gone were the customers drifting in with apologies for busted brakes or sputtering engines. Gone was the phone ringing off the hook, the clang of tools being swapped in a rush. At night it was quieter, the smell of oil and rubber hanging in the air like memory itself. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, though he hadn't been working on anything. He just needed something to do, something to keep him steady, while Claire sat on the low bench near the wall, her shoulders curved inward like the weight of the city was pressing down on her alone. He'd seen her in boardrooms on TV, in photographs in glossy magazines, always upright, unshakable, a fortress of sharp eyes and sharper words. But here, in the dim glow of the single hanging bulb, she looked stripped down to her most fragile edges. Her hair had fallen loose from its careful twist, her mascara smudged faintly as if she hadn't bothered to wipe it away. She looked less like a CEO and more like someone who had been running for years and finally realized she was too tired to keep sprinting. "You don't owe me this fight," Ethan said quietly, leaning against the hood of the truck behind him. His voice was low, steady, but carrying something heavier beneath it. "Walk away if it costs you everything. I've been on my own before. I'll be fine." Her head snapped up, eyes glistening, her voice rough with disbelief. "Fine?" She shook her head, standing as though the bench itself had betrayed her. "Don't you get it? You and Maya, you're the only thing I've found worth losing everything for." The rag stilled in Ethan's hands. The words cut through him, not sharp like a wound, but deep like something reaching into the hollow places he'd tried to fill with work, with silence, with survival. His breath caught, and for once he couldn't think of anything to say. He had lost so much already. His wife, the sense of belonging he once thought permanent, the feeling that life was still something he could build rather than just endure. To hear this woman who had everything the world measured as success stand in his worn-down garage and tell him he and his daughter were worth it, it landed with a weight that felt almost holy. He stared at her, stunned into silence. Her eyes, usually so controlled, were wide and vulnerable, shimmering with the kind of truth no press release could hold. He wanted to say something back, wanted to reach across the space between them and give her whatever words would steady her trembling shoulders. But all he could manage was standing still, letting the enormity of what she'd given him sink in. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft creak of the office door. Maya padded in barefoot, her braids slightly messy, her little arms hugging her favorite sketchbook to her chest. She took one look at Claire, eyes shining with unshed tears, and without hesitation walked over and climbed into her lap as if she belonged there. Claire startled, a half-laugh, half-sob breaking from her throat as Maya settled against her, tiny hands pressing into her arms for balance. "Then don't cry any more," Maya said simply. her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had decided the world could be that easy. Claire laughed again, this time through the tears that finally spilled over. She pressed her forehead gently against Maya's hair, breathing in the innocence, the safety she had never known as a child and never thought she'd be allowed as an adult. Her arms closed around the little girl like she was holding onto the anchor she didn't know she needed. Ethan watched, his chest tight. The image burned itself into him. Claire, the woman the world saw as steel and fire, undone by the comfort of a child's simple wisdom. He felt something stir inside him, something that had been buried under years of grief and grit. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude, it was the dangerous, undeniable spark of hope. For a long while they stayed like that, the three of them suspended in a fragile, beautiful quiet. The garage around them smelled of grease and gasoline. The floor was stained with years of labor, but in that moment it felt more sacred than any cathedral. Claire's laughter softened, blending with Maya's gentle humming, and Ethan thought maybe, just maybe, they were building something here that couldn't be measured in money or headlines. Maybe they were building a family, and as Claire brushed a tear from her cheek, smiling down at Maya, Ethan realized something else. She might still be afraid. The world might still come for her, but here in his garage, in this tiny pocket of truth, she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The boardroom had never felt colder. The table stretched long and glossy, every reflection sharp, every pair of eyes trained on Claire as though she were already guilty. They didn't waste time with preamble. A man in a gray suit slid a folder across the table, his tone clipped, rehearsed. It's simple. You create distance between yourself and this mechanic, or you resign. The words didn't surprise her. She'd seen them coming for weeks, the murmurs building like storm clouds, the photos in tabloids, the investors' restless questions, Langdon's sneers. She had thought maybe she could straddle both worlds, but the choice was always going to come to this: untouchable or devoured. She sat straighter, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "And if I walk?" she asked. "Headlines," another replied flatly. "Stock will plummet. We'll stabilize eventually, but you'll be finished." For a long moment she stared at the polished wood beneath her hands, her own reflection looking back, distorted. She had fought her way into this room, bled for the right to sit at this table. Every inch of progress, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, it all lived here. But when she lifted her gaze, she didn't see pride in the faces around her. She saw hunger, fear, calculation. She saw a life that had cost her more than it had ever given. She closed the folder without even opening it. "Then I resign," she said. Gasps rippled, sharp and immediate. One board member nearly dropped his pen. Another muttered, "She's bluffing." But Claire stood, steady, her eyes clear for the first time in years. "Effective immediately," she added, and walked out before they could argue, before they could shrink her resolve down to fear. By the time she reached the street, her phone was vibrating nonstop. News alerts, investors, friends who weren't really friends, reporters shouting through the static of unanswered calls. She ignored them all. She loosened her hair, pulled it into a ponytail with a band from her wrist, and drove. The garage looked exactly as it always did. Battered sign, cracked pavement, one overhead light flickering, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to die. Ethan was bent over the hood of a pickup, sleeves rolled, his hand steady, even as his jaw carried that stubborn set she knew so well. Maya sat nearby on a stool, swinging her legs, sketchbook balanced on her knees. The ordinariness of it nearly undid her. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jangling. No assistant, no chauffeur, no press, just her, in jeans and sneakers, hair pulled back, the weight of 1,000 cameras and shareholders left behind. "I quit," she said simply. Ethan's head snapped up. His rag fell from his hand onto the floor. For a moment he looked like she'd spoken in another language. "You? What?" "I quit," she repeated, her voice calm, almost light. "I resigned. Walked away. It's done." His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Finally the words tumbled out, rough and stunned. "For me?" She shook her head, stepping closer. "For me. For my daughter. For what matters." The air between them charged, thick with disbelief and something heavier. Ethan's hands flexed, as though he didn't know whether to pull her close or shake sense into her. His eyes searched hers, caught between awe and frustration. She could see the war in him, the man who wanted to protect her from regret, and the man who wanted to believe her courage was real. He whispered it again, softer this time. "You quit." "For freedom," she said. "For a life I don't have to defend every second. For the chance to sit in a garage and not feel like it's a scandal. For you. For her." She didn't say love. She didn't need to. The truth was written in the way her voice cracked, in the tremble of her shoulders, in the way her eyes begged him to believe her. Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, hands still at his sides, as though if he reached for her, it would all vanish like a dream. And then, before either of them could decide what to do next, Maya slid off her stool, sketchbook tumbling to the ground. She bounded over, her little arms wrapping tight around both of them, pulling them together with more strength than her small body should have had. "Now you can come over any time," she beamed, her face pressed between them. "No more secrets." No more waiting. Claire laughed through the tears burning her eyes, clutching Maya close as Ethan's arm finally settled around both of them. His grip was firm, steady, protective, but there was something else in it too. Something that felt like surrender, not defeat, but acceptance. For the first time in years, Claire Donovan wasn't untouchable, wasn't devoured. She was simply held. And in that oil-stained garage, with Maya grinning up at them like she'd just won the world, Claire realized she hadn't lost everything at all. She had finally found it. The lot looked different in the morning light. For years it had been just another forgotten corner of town. Cracked asphalt littered with weeds, the smell of rust heavy in the air. Ethan had always dreamed of more for it, but dreams were expensive, and survival came first. Most days, the thought of expanding the garage into anything beyond a one-man shop felt as impossible as touching the sky. But now, standing there with Claire at his side, and Maya twirling in the dust with her braid catching the sun, it didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt inevitable. Claire had put her severance into his hands without hesitation. No contracts, no spreadsheets, no endless meetings dissecting cost projections. Just trust. "Engines teach patience," Ethan had said when she asked him why this mattered so much. "They teach that when something doesn't work, you take it apart, you figure out where it failed, and you put it back together. Kids need that, especially the ones who don't have anyone telling them they're worth fixing." That answer stayed with her. For years, Claire had measured worth in numbers, market share, revenue, shareholder confidence. She had built towers of glass and steel, empires that stretched across continents, but never once had she thought about a child sitting at a bench, holding a wrench, realizing for the first time that they could build something with their own hands. Now, that image made her chest ache in the best way. The work began slowly. They cleared the lot first, ripping up the weeds, sweeping away years of dust and debris. Ethan hauled scrap with the ease of a man who had spent his life lifting more than his share, while Claire tied her hair back and carried lumber, refusing to stand aside. Maya was everywhere at once, painting signs in neon colors, sketching out how she thought the new classroom should look, directing volunteers like a commander with crayons instead of maps. Word spread and soon others joined. Neighbors came with hammers, local teens showed up after school, teachers dropped by with boxes of books for the lounge they planned to add. Slowly, the garage stopped looking like a place of endings and started looking like a place of beginnings. They put in long work days, covered in sawdust and grease, falling asleep with sore muscles and waking up ready to do it again. One afternoon, Claire sat on the curb, her jeans streaked with oil, watching a boy of 12 tighten a bolt with Ethan guiding his hands. The boy's brow furrowed, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. When the bolt clicked into place, his grin was so wide it nearly split his face. Ethan clapped him on the back, murmuring encouragement. Claire felt something inside her stir, something she hadn't felt when signing multi-million-dollar deals. Joy that was pure, unfiltered, undeserved but entirely hers to hold. Maya named it. Of course she did. One evening, with her sketchbook spread across the hood of Ethan's truck, she drew a building with wide doors and kids spilling out, all with smudged hands and smiling faces. Above it, she wrote in big looping letters, "The Heart Shop." When Claire asked why, Maya looked at her like the answer was obvious. Because it fixes more than cars. It fixes people. The name stuck. Soon a hand-painted sign hung above the entrance, crooked but beautiful, declaring to the world what the place was. Claire found herself smiling more here than she had in years. She wiped grease from children's cheeks, knelt beside girls who were scared to touch tools, told them stories of her father's shop and how he had once shown her the same things Ethan was showing them now. She didn't feel out of place anymore. The woman who once brokered deals over champagne now crouched in overalls beside a girl with chipped nail polish, teaching her how to steady a socket wrench. At night, when the kids had gone home and the tools were set aside, she would lean against Ethan's shoulder, exhausted but content. "You built this," she whispered once. He shook his head. "We built this." The shop became a sanctuary, not glossy, not perfect. The walls bore fingerprints, the floors held permanent stains, but laughter echoed through the halls, louder than any music she had ever heard at a gala. Children who once shuffled in with wary eyes now left with confidence etched into their posture. Parents thanked them with teary voices, and every time Claire caught sight of that crooked sign, "The Heart Shop," she felt more pride than any award she'd ever accepted. She had once believed her worth was tied to skyscrapers and stock prices. But here, wiping oil from a child's cheek and feeling Maya press close against her side, she realized she had been wrong. Worth wasn't in numbers. It was in moments like this, in hands that learned to build instead of break, in lives that were quietly, stubbornly changed. For the first time, Claire Donovan felt like she hadn't just built an empire. She had built a home. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after long hours filled with hammering, chatter, and the laughter of kids who had left their fingerprints all over the freshly painted walls. The Heart Shop sat still beneath them, the scent of new lumber and motor oil drifting faintly upward. Ethan and Claire had climbed onto the roof after everyone else had gone home, their clothes still streaked with paint, their muscles aching with the good kind of exhaustion. Above them, the stars scattered across the sky, faint against the glow of the city but still stubbornly shining. Claire leaned against him, her hair falling loose around her face, her head resting just below his shoulder. She looked nothing like the woman who once walked stages in heels and tailored suits. Her jeans were smeared with white paint, her sneakers dotted with oil, and yet she had never looked more at home in her skin. Ethan glanced at her out of the corner of his eye and felt something uncoil in his chest, something that had been wound tight for years. "You know why I cried that night?" she asked softly, her voice carrying into the open sky as though it were afraid of being heard indoors. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the stars. "No," Claire exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of years she hadn't spoken about. "Because I thought no one would ever stop for me again." The words landed between them like a confession, fragile but undeniable. Ethan turned then, his eyes steady on hers, the kind of look that saw straight through armor and titles. "I'll never stop," he said. For a moment she searched his face, as though trying to find any cracks in the promise. But there weren't any. His voice was rough but certain, and the silence that followed didn't ask for more explanation. She lifted her hand, fingers brushing the stubble along his jaw, and then leaned in. The kiss was gentle, not rushed or frantic, but sure. It wasn't the kiss of two people hiding, or wondering if they'd regret it in the morning. It was the kiss of people who had walked through storms and decided, finally, to stand still together. Ethan's hand came up to steady her against him, his fingers curling lightly against her back. When they pulled apart, Claire's eyes shimmered faintly, not with fear this time, but with something closer to peace. She gave a soft laugh, unpolished and real, shaking her head as though she still couldn't believe she was here, on a rooftop, smelling of grease and paint, kissing a man who once fixed her car in the rain. Ethan didn't laugh. He just sat there, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Rachel had died, since he'd buried himself in work and silence, he didn't feel like he was patching holes in a sinking ship. He didn't feel like he was fixing broken pieces that would only break again. He felt like he was building something, whole, steady, lasting. Claire leaned back against him, her shoulder brushing his as they turned their eyes to the stars again. The night stretched quiet around them, but it wasn't the empty kind of quiet Claire knew from her penthouse. It was the full kind, rich with possibility, with laughter echoing faintly from memory, with the heartbeat of something new being born. Maya's crayon drawing hung in Claire's mind, 3 figures holding hands beneath the word family. For so long she had dismissed it as a child's hopeful dream. But here, on the roof of the heart shop, surrounded by the smell of paint and the ghost of children's laughter, Claire realized it hadn't been a dream at all. It was a prophecy. Ethan reached for her hand, calloused fingers threading with hers, and she squeezed back, her smile small but unshakable. The world outside could still call her reckless, investors could still sneer, Langdon could still mock. None of it mattered tonight. Tonight, she wasn't a CEO or a headline. She was a woman who had been stranded once on a rainy road, who had been seen by someone who refused to pass her by. She turned her face toward him again, studying the man who had changed the trajectory of her life without even trying. "You really mean it," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I don't make promises I can't keep." And under the starlight, with the hum of the city below and the memory of children's laughter still clinging to the air, Claire believed him. For the first time in years, she believed in something that couldn't be measured or bought. She believed in them, and Ethan, with her hand in his and her head resting against his shoulder, believed in himself again. The rain came suddenly, hammering against the tin roof of the garage in a rhythm that felt eerily familiar. It was the same heavy kind of storm that had brought them together months ago, the kind that blurred headlights and soaked bones, the kind that could turn loneliness into something unbearable. But tonight was different. Tonight the doors of the heart shop closed with laughter echoing behind them. Tools put away, children's drawings taped to the walls, the smell of paint and oil and possibility woven into the air. Ethan turned the last key in the lock, his calloused hands steady, his shoulders no longer carrying the weight of a man walking through life alone. Claire stood beside him, her hair tied back, sneakers splattered with grease and streaks of blue paint from where Maya had accidentally tagged her earlier that afternoon. She didn't look like the woman who once ruled boardrooms. She looked like herself, lighter, freer, untethered. And for Ethan, that was more breathtaking than any photograph of her in a magazine. Maya twirled in the puddles just outside the door, her braid whipping behind her as she lifted her face to the sky, giggling at the way the drops clung to her cheeks. Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating her like a spark of the very joy she carried with her everywhere she went. She stopped, pointed at the storm with wide eyes, and grinned. "Maybe someone else needs saving tonight," she said, her voice bright, innocent, certain. The words hit Ethan square in the chest. He looked at her, then at Claire, and something inside him tightened, not with fear, not with grief, but with pride. He stepped closer to Claire, slipped his arm around her shoulders, and pulled her in against him. She leaned without hesitation, her body fitting into the curve of his side, as though it had always belonged there. "We'll stop," Ethan promised, his voice quiet but resolute, the kind of promise that carried more weight than any deal ever signed. Claire turned her face up toward him, rain catching in her lashes, and smiled. Not the practiced smile of cameras, not the polite curve of lips she'd used to charm investors. A real smile, softened at the edges, glowing with something he recognized as peace. She squeezed his hand, not because she needed reassurance, but because she wanted to remind him she was there. No tears, no hesitation, just warmth. The storm didn't feel ominous anymore. It didn't feel like something to endure. It felt like a hymn, a steady percussion to the life they'd built together. Maya ran back toward them, shoes splashing, her laughter rising above the thunder. She threw her arms around both of them, pulling them together with the fearless certainty only a child could carry. "Come on," she urged. "We'll get soaked." Ethan chuckled, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "That's kind of the point, kiddo." So they stepped out, the three of them, into the downpour. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled, and still they walked forward. No umbrellas, no armor, no need to hide from the storm. Their clothes clung to them, their hair plastered to their skin, but none of it mattered. Because this time, the rain didn't mean endings. It meant beginnings. They were no longer fragments. An overworked mechanic with grief etched into his hands, a CEO who had forgotten her own heart, a little girl who had learned too young what absence felt like. They were a family now, stitched together not by perfection, but by the courage to stop, to see each other, to stay. Claire tilted her face up, laughing as the drops hit her cheeks. Ethan pulled her closer, his hand warm against her back despite the chill. Maya darted ahead, spinning in the middle of the street, her voice carrying through the storm. "We're all together," she shouted. "We're all home." And she was right. As the three of them walked into the rain, unafraid, Ethan realized something he hadn't let himself believe in years. Home wasn't walls or a roof or a name etched on a lease. Home was this: calloused hands entwined with softer ones, a child's laughter bouncing against thunder, a woman who had once been unreachable now choosing to stand in the storm with him. Lightning cracked again, and instead of flinching, they smiled. Because sometimes the fiercest storms didn't break you. Sometimes they reminded you that you were already whole. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know which part spoke to you most. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story of love, hope, and second chances. Until then, stay kind, stay brave, and keep believing in the beauty of everyday people.